Thank you very much, David. I was hoping that being good at second marking wasn't going to be my main strength, but a lot of the things that David's touched on, I am going to cover in the presentation today. Just to give you a little bit more insight as to where I'm coming from with this, prior to joining Hope, I spent 12 years as a specialist dyslexia tutor in sixth form, further education, higher education. I've got a PGCE in post-compulsory education, plus a specialist master's level teaching qualification. I've taught a master's course to qualified teachers wanting to specialise in dyslexia. I hold a practising certificate, which is an indication that I can do dyslexia assessments to the standard of an educational psychologist. I've been a member of the British Dyslexia Association, an association for specialist dyslexia teachers. So I haven't climbed down from some ivory tower to kind of say what I'm going to say, but what I am going to say sort of reflects that that experience. And I've been working with students labelled as dyslexic and with their teachers for pretty much all of my professional life. So I do feel as though, to a degree at least, I appreciate some of the struggles that students identified as dyslexic go to, and I'm not questioning or doubting those difficulties. But as an educator, and as David's mentioned, coming from a kind of disability studies perspective, I want all students not only to succeed academically, but to enjoy and to flourish in their education. And what I do want to do is question how useful the dominant paradigm for understanding dyslexia is, and how helpful our current practices are in achieving inclusive education for students with perceived literacy difficulties. So a key point here is, or to be clear, the problems of dyslexia, I think, are real, but they are caused by the pressure to conform to a literate norm and prejudicial attitudes towards those who do not meet our normative expectations for literacy, at least as much as they are caused by natural, predictable variations in literacy and learning ability. So, excuse me, I have got a bit of a cough. If I start to splutter halfway through, that's why. These are the three dangers I'm going to be talking about. Labelling, what Lopez calls biologising dyslexia, which is the kind of dominant paradigm that I just mentioned, and current literacy ideology. Now, you can summarise the reasons given in favour of labelling certain students, pupils, as having special educational needs, including dyslexia, in this way, right? To inform individualised teaching interventions, specific, appropriate individualised teaching interventions, to establish rights and eligibility for legal protection, assistive technologies, alternative assessment arrangements, to inform research, develop, there's a typo there, isn't there? Help develop and use, that should say, alternative pedagogies, and finally to offer an explanation for the difficulties which have been observed. Now, I think there are significant problems with each of these justifications as they apply to dyslexia. The assumption that the label will provide a passport to appropriate individualised interventions in order to improve the individual's learning is problematic on at least three fronts. Although many mainstream teachers report feeling that the dyslexia label is helpful in enabling them to understand a child's difficulties and wanting to act positively towards dyslexic children, they also feel that they do not have the skills, knowledge or training to implement the kind of intervention the label is meant to prompt. There can be only two outcomes from this. The teacher could continue to differentiate the intended learning as best they can in order to take account of their perception of the child's needs. But this is not the same as providing specific, appropriate, individualised intervention. The other possible outcome then is to transfer responsibility for the intervention to somebody else, probably a specialist teacher. This in itself is problematic on two fronts. Firstly, withdrawing a child from the mainstream class and curriculum is segregationist and fundamentally anti-inclusive. Although prompted by an inclusive ethos, such interventions mark students out as inferior or lacking. It stigmatises them and isolates them from the curriculum and the social environment of the classroom. Secondly, although these specialist interventions purport to be individualised, experience suggests that they are only superficially so. For 3 years, I taught an MA in specific learning difficulties. That's an umbrella term for dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and other aspects of neurodiversity. The MA in specific learning difficulties is a demanding, continuing professional development course for qualified teachers wanting to specialise in dyslexia. The course is accredited by the British Dyslexia Association, who also oversee the curriculum and the assessment of candidates. The BDA guidelines for professional accreditation and the way the course is presented to participants place great emphasis on participants designing, and I'm quoting the core assessment criteria here, structured, sequential, multisensory teaching programmes to meet specific individual needs. Yet the reality was that in order to gain approval and accreditation from the VDA, specialist teachers are expected to operate within severe constraints to individuality and personalisation. They were strongly encouraged to stick to a rigid, formulaic pattern of teaching and learning activities. They're expected to follow not only a standardised lesson plan and scheme of work, but also to use particular approved multisensory routines within that structure and even to keep to recommended durations for each activity. Thus, the level of individualisation only really extended to the entry point and minor variations on what was essentially an off-the-shelf literacy programme based on a proprietary, highly structured approach to synthetic phonics. This is despite the fact that for a significant number of people identified as dyslexic, phonological processing is not the main difficulty, and phonics may not be an effective intervention for them. Moreover, the virtual insistence on a highly structured synthetic phonics approach even extended to dyslexic students in further and higher education, many of whom have developed their own literacy strategies in order to be able to continue their studies that far, and would see synthetic phonics as irrelevant, if not childish and patronising. In some, the claim to specific individualised interventions seems, to me at least, rather overstated. The process of dyslexia assessment, and in some cases the issuing of a statement of special educational needs, which are meant to ensure legal protection and educational accommodations for students deemed dyslexic, are also highly problematic. It's well known that many parents, unless they can afford an educational psychologist's fees, have to fight, sometimes for years, to have their child assessed for dyslexia. And many schools and local authorities are reluctant to support this process and even contest the decision to grant protections and accommodations when the assessment confirms that the child is dyslexic. Meanwhile, the child continues to struggle at school. Of course, many children are assessed and are told that they are dyslexic and receive interventions such as the specialist literacy teaching I've just discussed and access to assistive technologies and examination access arrangements. But what of the child or the student who seems to be struggling with literacy or learning but who is deemed not to be dyslexic for one reason or another? The child who, for example, has a borderline or atypical assessment profile that means the assessor cannot conclude they are dyslexic. I would estimate that I have done around 300 dyslexia assessments in my professional life. So that's 300 people, I reckon, I've told I think are or are not dyslexic. before I got increasingly uncomfortable with doing that for the kind of reasons David mentioned. Now, the implications of this are huge. If you tell somebody they're dyslexic, number one, you're telling them effectively that they're disabled, which is a big thing to tell someone. And it has a lot of implications for them and their sense of identity. But you're also probably opening the door to a range of teaching interventions, assistive technologies, and access arrangements in exams. And you have to make a decision, right? You can't say, I don't know. You can't say maybe. You have to say, yes, you are, or no, you're not. And what of the kid whose literacy difficulties are put down to English being their second language, or the fact that they're part of the traveller community, or the fact that they're just not very bright? All of these students are far less likely to receive any of the accommodations and support granted to students deemed dyslexic, even though their difficulties with literacy and learning might be just as frustrating and limiting. There is a dyslexia-friendly schools kite mark. There is not a moderate learning difficulty kite mark. For such reasons, it's possible to conceive of dyslexics as in some ways a privileged group who have access to teaching, support and resources denied to other students whose needs may be just as great. It's worth knowing that there are no literacy pedagogies and learning pedagogies which have been shown to be effective for students identified as dyslexic and yet not to work for other students. Students, or rather the teachers on the master's course I've mentioned, they often seem to arrive, I think I got the impression they are expecting me to induct them into some kind of black magic, right, or spells they could cast over their dyslexic students. And it was a surprise to them often that there were no dark arts to dyslexia tuition and literacy learning, just ways of teaching and learning which are more or less effective for any given student. So given this, and the fact that supposedly individualised interventions are often only superficially so, that the assessment process itself may obstruct rather than facilitate access to educational opportunities, it's perhaps worth considering whether the alternative literacy pedagogies and other interventions do in fact need to be tied to the dyslexia label, or whether more students would learn better if we attended more closely to their individual capabilities and needs without the dyslexia labelling that empowers some children but stigmatises and denies others. So far I've discussed difficulties with two of the justifications given for labelling some children as dyslexic. I'll now move on to the second two. That's the idea that it can inform research and new teaching interventions, and that it provides an explanation for literacy and learning difficulties. So, since first described as word blindness and then strephosymbolia over 115 years ago, the conundrum of apparently inexplicable literacy difficulties in otherwise capable children has motivated a colossal amount of research. The first investigations into what we now call dyslexia were by doctors and medical men, and the vast majority of research continues to use the psychomedical paradigm. Having a group of people identified as dyslexic is helpful in providing both a justification for research and a population to research. And as access to technologies like fMRI scanners becomes more widespread, investigations continue to try and identify a neurobiological cause for dyslexia. In December, for example, Science published an advance on the currently favoured phonological deficit hypothesis, which claimed that impaired access to mental representations of speech sounds underlies dyslexics' reading and spelling difficulties, rather than the poor quality mental representations as previously thought. However, in over a century of research with hundreds of books and thousands of scholarly articles published, we still have no satisfactory neurobiological or psychological explanation of dyslexia. Instead, we have a number of contradictory, competing and inadequate hypotheses. Phonological deficit hypothesis, working memory hypothesis, magnocellular theory, double deficit hypothesis, and a whole load of others. None of these alone can explain all of the cognitive dispositions and behavioural manifestations currently attributed to dyslexia. For example, the phonological deficit hypothesis, which relates to the processing of speech sounds, cannot explain the visual distortions of printed text experienced and frequent letter reversals made by many dyslexic people. Only the magnocellular deficit theory offers a still hypothetical and still highly contested explanation for this. And the converse of this is true. Magnocellular theory cannot explain variations in people's phonological processing ability, and why many people labelled as dyslexic tend to struggle with telling apart the different speech sounds in words and word games like spoonerisms. Neither is it clear how a phonological deficit can be related to clumsiness and untidy handwriting, which are often associated with dyslexia, nor to difficulties with accurately estimating time. These are some of the better-known manifestations of dyslexia. Others reported in the literature include, but are far from limited to, are you ready for this? Left-right confusion, difficulty reading aloud, poor memory, especially working memory, difficulty with sequencing, disorganisation and messiness, tendency to daydream, tendency to stutter or mumble, late maturation or developmental delay, social immaturity, language immaturity, excessive talkativeness, lack of fluency in own language and difficulty learning foreign languages, distractibility, impulsiveness or perseveration, which is persevering way too long, high talent in visuospatial skills, good at drawing, strong visual imagination, love of construction, a good musical ear but also poor sense of rhythm, being extra sensitive to touch or certain sounds, susceptibility to allergies, and these are some of my favourite ones, having an especially large head, early greying of the hair, I don't know how it's useful to know that, and becoming disorientated in large enclosed spaces, which I think means you get dizzy in aircraft hangars. Of course, the disadvantages of such long lists are that they have limited use in identifying dyslexia and in deciding on educational interventions. But besides this, is it really tenable to believe that apparent associations between all these remarkably diverse traits can be explained by a single biological entity called dyslexia? Especially when many of the supposedly defining characteristics of dyslexia, letter reversals, clumsiness, poor laterality in memory, are commonly found in people without reading difficulties, as well as in poor readers deemed not dyslexic, and when some dyslexics are reported to only have mild literacy difficulties. At best, it would seem that dyslexia must be viewed as an umbrella term which covers a wide range of observed behaviours and perceived difficulties, or what Thomas West calls constellations of traits, which must necessarily be explained by a number of causes rather than a single entity called dyslexia. Excuse me. Biological research into the causes of dyslexia is often justified on the grounds that it would enable the development of more effective interventions for literacy difficulties, especially in reading. Certainly such research is exciting and has produced a lot of valuable insights into the process of reading. We now know a lot more about which areas and systems of the brain are recruited for the complex set of subtasks that must be performed in order to read fluently, and this body of knowledge looks set to grow. But current methodologies and evidence from this field must be viewed with some caution. Many brain imaging studies, for instance, use samples made up partly of diagnosed dyslexics, partly of poor readers who have not been diagnosed as dyslexic, and partly of, quote, normally achieving readers. Or sometimes the decision to assign participants to the dyslexic or non-dyslexic group is made according to researcher-defined criteria rather than full diagnosis. Yet the evidence gained from these studies is often used to draw conclusions about the differences between dyslexic and non-dyslexics rather than relatively good and relatively poor readers. In the excitement about these technologies, it's all too easily forgotten that the differences in brain activation that the images show, and that you often see reported in the newspapers, for example, only demonstrate correlation, not causality. There's a tendency to conclude that dyslexics are worse at reading than non-dyslexics because they're using less efficient mechanisms in different parts of the brain, and that they're using those less efficient parts because of some predetermined disposition influenced by genetic inheritance. However, as Lopez points out, the eagerness to biologise this relationship overlooks the fact that the observed differences may be effects rather than causes. That is, more proficient readers are more proficient because they've read more, and that this practice effect has resulted in the reallocation of reading function from the less efficient parts of the brain, used when they learn to read and are still used by less practiced dyslexic readers, to more efficient parts of the brain. A key implication of this is that there is in fact no underlying congenital difference between supposedly dyslexic and non-dyslexic brains, merely differences in stages of development that could potentially be resolved through appropriate teaching intervention and reading practice. Of course, it may be that ultimately neurobiological investigations will provide a causal explanation for dyslexia that satisfies all parties, but it's worth remembering that they've been on the brink of doing so for some decades now, and that such an explanation remains tantalisingly out of reach. So, for example, in 2011, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is the kind of place neurobiological researchers want to get published, Rashler, Zook and Garb, I love these combinations of names, Rashler, Zook and Garb published a study which concluded that underactivation in the neural networks thought responsible for phonological processing can be identified in people with developmental dyslexia. And you can see in this research the prompt for the Lopez quote, which is on the screen. The sample in their study was preschoolers, children about to go into kindergarten. That means they were pre-literate and so could not be confirmed as dyslexic because dyslexia is about difficulties with literacy. Therefore, the children were assigned as being at risk or not at risk of developing dyslexia according to family incidence of developmental dyslexia, though the criteria for deciding this, for example, whether it was clinical diagnosis or self-report, are not stated. Now, interestingly, the two subgroups, that's those at risk of dyslexia and those not, supposedly, had virtually identical sight reading ability at entry to the preschool. Now, Rashler, Zook and Garb gave a purely biological explanation for dyslexia, citing genes, sensory deficit, phonological processing, linguistic impairments, hypoactivation in the left hemisphere, and differences in grey matter volume as possible causes. They say that they observed no differences in the home literacy environment between the at-risk and the not at-risk groups. This is curious to me because in the supplementary information published alongside the study about their sample, it says that, or it's clear that, children allocated to the at-risk of dyslexia group tended to come from homes where adults spent an hour a week less reading to children. Now, in the early years of a young child's life, at a crucial stage of their brain formation, it seems like an hour a week difference reading over several years might in fact have a significant implication for brain development and future literacy acquisition. Not only that, but children in the at-risk group came from homes where there tended to be fewer children's books and fewer books overall. The adults in those homes reported helping children with homework more frequently, but overall spent less time reading to children, even though those children tended to be asked to be read to more often than the control group children did. And that they came from homes where families were less likely to share rhymes and jokes frequently. In other words, there seemed to be less of a family culture of reading and the kinds of linguistic activity that might scaffold phonological processing and literacy development. Yet the only explanation given any credence is a biological one, which assumes a direction of causality for which there is still no compelling evidence. A major irony here is that as yet, the significant body of neuroanatomical research has yet to produce any effective educational interventions for dyslexia. Raschler, Zuck and Garb typically concluded by saying that advances in future research may lead to effective strategies, but this has been said since at least the 1980s. Genetic and brain imaging studies may have their uses, but they tell us nothing about how to teach people who have difficulty meeting our cultural expectations of literacy. The most commonly advocated approach, as I've said, is a systematic, highly structured program based on synthetic phonics, but there's nothing new in this. Highly structured programs based on synthetic phonics have been around since before 1920 and in constant use. And even eminent researchers in the field have admitted that the psychomedical evidence does not provide compelling justification for the interventions advocated. Usha Goswami, who's a professor of cognitive developmental neuroscience at the University of Oxford and widely regarded as an authority in dyslexia, and Peter Watts, who's also a professor of psychology at Oxford, in their book Phonological Skills and Learning to Read, said this: "We have had to come to two uncomfortable conclusions, uncomfortable at any rate for the authors of a book about phonological awareness and reading. The first is that there is very little direct evidence that children who are learning to read do rely on letter-sound relationships to help them read words. The second is that there is a great deal of evidence that these young children take easily and naturally to reading words in other ways." From this, it would seem that the idea that the dyslexia label is some sort of passport to scientifically proven specialised teaching interventions is flawed. To be sure, it may well trigger some sort of teaching intervention, but it's spurious to believe that such an intervention has a robust empirical basis. Whilst it cannot be denied that many dyslexic people find these approaches helpful, we must bear in mind the fact that there is no teaching approach which appears to be effective for them which is not effective for other groups of learners experiencing literacy difficulties. Indeed, the opposite seems to be true. The approaches which are advocated initially for dyslexics often end up being implemented with others who are perceived to be underachieving. In addition, there do not seem to be significant differences in levels of improvement in the targeted skill domain between dyslexic and other subgroups of students using such interventions. We've seen that there's no consensus on what dyslexia is and therefore who is or is not dyslexic, nor on what causes dyslexia. And this is not a controversial assertion. We've also seen that although psychomedical and biological research has given us some useful insights into literacy processes and variations between people, it cannot yet give a full account of these processes, cannot reliably distinguish between dyslexic and non-dyslexic subgroups, and that such an endeavour may be futile. We've also seen that dyslexia is associated with a very diverse range of characteristics, and that partly because of this, each person's experience of dyslexia is unique. From this, it would seem that the claim that dyslexia offers a helpful explanation for someone's learning and literacy difficulties might be an illusory one. It appears to offer an explanation because it allows people to give a socially acceptable name to the problem, but provides little of substance beyond that. Here we're about to move on to more controversial ground. If nobody can agree what dyslexia is or how it's caused, if the assessment and label ultimately tell us little about the person and their learning, if even advocates of labelling dyslexic children admit that half find the label stigmatising, if labelling some people as dyslexic grants access to resources denied others who may be experiencing similar difficulties, if psychomedical research is useless for producing teaching interventions and inhibits the allocation of resources for research into teaching, should we continue to label some children as dyslexic and others as not? To suggest not is heretical and dangerous because it provokes and threatens an influential research community, the vested interests of powerful charities, the dyslexia and broader SEN industries, the structure of educational provision, and perhaps those who would assert a dyslexic identity. But to be clear, not questioning the dyslexic experience and nor anybody's struggles with literacy and learning. Only questioning how helpful our current ideologies and practices around dyslexia are. And the idea of a literate norm, how helpful our current ideologies and practices around dyslexia and the idea of a literate norm are in achieving an inclusive education and society. And suggesting that teaching deficits and prejudicial attitudes towards those who do not meet our cultural expectations of literacy are often just as valid an explanation of the negative aspects of the dyslexic experience as patterns of variation in brain structure and function. Given that approaches that work well with dyslexic learners are also effective with others, that psychological assessments and research ultimately do little to inform teaching practice, and that individualised interventions are divisive and segregationist, perhaps it would be fairer and more inclusive to offer differentiated and personalised teaching and learning without tying it to the diagnostic label, while striving towards a less judgmental society which would not look so harshly upon naturally occurring variations in reading and writing proficiency. Now, given the complexity of the orchestration of sensory and cognitive processes required to be proficient in the cultural invention we call literacy, perhaps we should marvel more that so many people learn to read and write with relative ease than that some people experience significant difficulties using these tools. However, the fact that we unquestioningly assume a literate norm means that in the minds of teachers, students, parents, the concept of dyslexia is inextricably linked to perceived literacy deficits. This is not surprising. It reflects official definitions, teacher training, research and policy discourse, media and commercial influence. But there's a danger, I think, that in this relentless focus on perceived deficits, we might be barking up the wrong tree. The deficit view of dyslexia depends on a particular and ideological view of literacy, which sees literacy as an individualised skill and something that can be measured according to universal criteria. However, ideas about what counts as literacy are changing, partly motivated by newly emerging literacy practices, many of which are mediated by digital technologies. Many of us would accept that composing a text message or reading a Twitter feed demands a slightly different set of competencies than those required for composing or reading an essay. A common response is to decry the decline in literacy standards technology is supposedly responsible for. This response ignores evidence which suggests that such informal literacy practices can be used to motivate and scaffold literacies which are more acceptable in schools. So another way to respond is to realise that rather than there being a single ideal form of literacy, which we should all strive towards, there are different kinds of literacies which are more or less appropriate for different contexts. That is, to recognise that literacy practices are situated and contextual. What counts as literacy therefore depends on audience, genre, medium, and the affordances of different semiotic modes, amongst other things. A key idea when thinking about emerging and technologically mediated literacy practices is the concept of multimodality. The traditional essay-type text essentially has one semiotic mode, the printed word. A multimodal text, in contrast, consists of several semiotic modes. It combines texts with modes such as sound, video, graphics, emoticons, gesture, animation, and even layout. Whilst, for example, school textbooks might contain some images and diagrams and therefore be considered multimodal, they still tend to privilege the written word. It cannot be disputed that the World Wide Web has made a superabundance of text available to us, and that it's, in some cases, people's difficulties with reading and writing has simply been transposed online. On the other hand, the nature of many texts is changing and multimodality is becoming more commonplace. This prompts reconsideration not only of what counts as literacy, but also how we conceptualise dyslexia and how we organise educational opportunities. On the screen, you can see 3 screenshots taken from research done for my doctoral thesis. In the research project, I was investigating the role of Facebook in motivating learning through literacy in a small group of sixth form students labelled as dyslexic. Far from shying away from Facebook because of fears around exposing their difficulties with typographic literacy, the participants enthusiastically embraced it as a research tool and an arena for critical and playful literacy learning. This finding perhaps challenges some of the assumptions around the relationship between dyslexia, literacy and learning. During her research for the project, one of the participants, Chloe, came across a video I'd posted a link to on the group Facebook page. It's the top left screenshot there. Now, this is Professor John Stein of Oxford University. They pop up a lot, don't they? Right, talking about the beneficial effects of fish oils on the brain and hence learning. Stein originated the magnocellular theory of dyslexia that I mentioned earlier. Now, in one lesson, Chloe watched the 7-minute video twice. Afterwards, she read some of the comments, the written comments on the page underneath the video, and then looked at some other reputable dyslexia research and information websites to corroborate what Stein had said, and that's the second screenshot there. So within the space of 45 minutes, she was able to find meaningful, relevant information quickly, accessing expert knowledge on a topic of great personal interest and significance, from an expert who normally publishes in textbooks and academic journals, and whose knowledge would therefore usually be inaccessible to a dyslexic A-level student. Chloe was also able to find additional knowledge quickly to help her triangulate and corroborate that knowledge. And finally, and this is the third screenshot, the universality and social nature of Facebook meant that she thought it would be helpful to post a link to the research, expecting others in the group would find it accessible and useful. Crucial here is the layout of the original multimodal web text and the significance given to the different modes. The video is given priority on the page. Written text is subservient to sound and image. Chloe is able to gain an understanding of a potentially difficult topic and then recruit this understanding to support her reading of the written comments underneath and the complex text on the dyslexia research sites she subsequently visits. She is thus able to contextualise and understand some challenging reading by recruiting understanding gained from video. My interpretation is that the multimodal framing achieved via video and some earlier classroom discussion helped motivate her to engage with some difficult text on the science of dyslexia, and Chloe was able to read intelligently and tactically in order to get the information she needed. This represents a significant shift in power, agency and sense of self as a successful learner from a student who asserted in her pre-project interview that much of the reading she was expected to do for the biology curriculum left her feeling, quote, down and defeatist, to the point where she feels as though I may as well just not bother. In fact, like many young people, the students in this study enthusiastically consumed, produced, remixed, shared, orchestrated an array of complex multimodal texts, with knowing how to produce and respond to them much more important. So, how to produce and respond to them in order to maximise their impact, much more important than explicitly knowing that there are genre rules to guide their construction and consumption. Rather than simply being defined by their deficiencies and difficulties with literacy, these students were in fact highly motivated to learn through literacy, when given a high degree of self-determination and agency. This way of working, adopting an ideology that recognises that literacy is above all a social practice rather than an individual skill, is a world away from remedial literacy programmes and endless synthetic phonics drills. At a time when not only the web, but the arrival of innovations such as 3D printers and haptic technologies in schools, technologies which ought to play to the creative, practical, visual thinking and kinesthetic strengths commonly associated with dyslexia, these suggest a challenge to the continuing dominance of the written world and even the possibility of a post-literate society. So it's worth questioning the relentless focus on perceived deficits and the drive to pressure students to conform to a narrow set of outmoded literacy standards derived from an idealised essay text. Or there's a danger we will continue to limit the educational opportunities, intellectual development and emotional well-being of the people we choose to call dyslexic. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Owen. We have about 10 minutes to push, so Owen's agreed kindly to answer a few questions. So
easy ones.
For my sake, can I just ask if you indicate who you are? Actually, that might be helpful to anyone who's not so familiar with the team. Any questions? You'll have to shout out if you have a question. Anyone? He's told me that he wants to do a question. So question number one. That's Irene.
Yes. Absolutely, yeah, of course. Is the whole idea of literacy value loaded? Of course it is. What I'm interested in here is what kinds of literacy we value. There's an assumption that there's often a kind of implicit assumption that there's one way of doing literacy and it's the correct way, and it's the way that I think of the way to phrase this now. Yeah, as I say, it's the idea that the essay text, and if you can, most of our sort of common sense ideas around literacy are derived from that one form of text, which ignores the fact that people produce different kinds of texts for different kinds of purposes in different kinds of contexts, and so the values associated with any literacy artifact or literacy process are shaped by the context in which it's produced. So, but there's an assumption, I think, that's often widespread in schools and universities for that matter, that the only literacy that really counts is the kind that is or is directly derived from the standard essay text. But I think we might do well to pay more attention. My values are that we might do well to pay more attention to other kinds of literacy, because they might be more effective ways for people to learn and to show what they know. I mean, how many people think that this isn't necessarily a rhetorical question, but how many people really think that an essay or an exam answer is really the best way for them to show people what they know about something, or tell people what they know about something, or that reading endless, scholarly articles, which are essay-type text, is always the best way to learn about something. And yet there's often an assumption that is the best way.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks, Sue. Any more?
Yeah, David? Yeah.
Thanks, David.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, of course. I think, yeah, I mean, you can't. Yeah, there are two issues, right? Of course, to get to this level of reading, you've got to have some more basic literacy skills, and it would be foolish to deny that. But we still have an expectation that people can and should learn to sort of what reading researchers call decode printed words on the page. But and that is true and will stay true in the foreseeable future. But there is a value still associated with that, in the sense of why do we expect people to do that? Because, for instance, nobody would question somebody with a blind person or a visual impairment using, say, text-to-speech software in order to read, because the idea that the whole process of reading, the purpose of reading, is to understand the author's ideas. Nobody would question some people's use of assistive technologies in that sense. It's acceptable. So why do we then question other people's use? Why do we insist on people having to decode printed words off the page when there are equally valid routes to that same learning, to that author's ideas? I mean, even for instance, the AQA, who aren't generally that forward-looking in these kinds of things, are making it easier for students to access text-to-speech software in exams. So there's a sort of recognition there that the process of reading isn't, doesn't have to be about decoding printed words off the page, but there are other ways to do it. So I think, there are two sides to it, but I think the whole thing is still underpinned by a core value that there's only one way to do reading that's the best way, and that's the traditional way, and everybody ought to do it if they can.
Thank you.
So Heather and Nick, yeah.
Nick, we'll have to make this the last.
Okay, yeah, just a quick one. I'm really interested by the biologising of the phenomenon generally.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that you raised caution in the sciences there. And it's an interesting sort of dichotomy, I suppose. It's very interesting science, and it gives us a real insight into how the brain works, and it's indeed very important. But I think you're quite right to raise caution. I mean, we're potentially feasible near future, not far away from finding genetic markers that can identify dyslexia or weak conventional dyslexia, and how that can, we can screen children for it before they go to school, for example, which could just put in terms of inclusive education, for example. It strikes me as an interdisciplinary issue where we need social science and hard science, neurobiology to mix. Do you see that ever happening?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there is a. I think increasingly researchers on both sides are realising that you can only really understand dyslexia if you pay attention. Dyslexia can only exist as an interaction between an individual brain and the culture around it, the society around it. So I think. Well, it's already happening, in fact. I've just found out about a research project done by somebody called Rosie Fluitt at the Institute of Education in London. She has up to now, done a lot of sort of ethnographic type research, often in preschoolers, about using multimodal literacy to help students with special educational needs develop literacy skills. She's partnered up with a bunch of cognitive scientists who are particularly interested in mirror neurons to try and figure out why iPads seem to engage learners so readily. So you're already starting to see those bridges, yeah, and I think that would increasingly happen because people realise that to understand what we now call dyslexia, you need to think about the individual and how they relate to the environment.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Owen.
Okay, thank you.